Welcome to Dental Business RX. Practice success in 30 minutes or less.
Thank you for calling ABC Dental.
When we use the term private dentistry, what does that even mean? While it may have many qualities or nuances as to how it's defined, to me it's got 5 defining hallmarks. 1, the practice is doctor-owned and doctor-operated. 2, the doctor has fee independence. They decide what they charge. 3, there's clinical autonomy. There's no insurance company, there's no corporate entity in the operatory telling you how to practice. 4, it's patient-centric, not volume-driven. You're not running people through like a factory to hit a number because of your fee structure. And 5, you have operational self-determination. The owner decides how the place runs. That's it. Doctor-owned, fee-independent, clinically autonomous, patient-first, self-determined. And that's the kind of dentistry most of you signed up to practice. And here's the uncomfortable part. Every one of those 5 points is under some degree of pressure right now, and moving toward extinction in some cases. Some of these points are slowly drifting away. Some are getting ripped out by the roots. Ownership is declining fast, especially amongst younger doctors. Fee independence is getting strangled by network contracts and umbrella plans. Clinical autonomy goes to whoever's signing the checks, and self-determination, ask anybody who's 70% in network how self-determined they feel when the PPO sets their fee. So if you ask me what the situation is in private dentistry, I'd say, it's in danger of losing a lot of what has made it private dentistry. And I don't say that to be dramatic, I say it because the numbers say it. I've been tracking various metrics and trends that shape the dental industry for well over a decade now. And I usually kick off our annual owners conference, our biggest event of the year. It's a graduate service with all of our clients, briefing MGE clients on the state of the industry, where things are going, where opportunities are, and how to take advantage of them, as well as where the problems are. And every year I turn around and do a version of it here on the show, because honestly, most dentists aren't getting this picture as a whole anywhere else. And that's what I want to cover in this week's episode. It's time for the annual update. We'll be taking a look at trends, what's coming, where private dentistry actually stands, and what the future may hold, the real picture, not the press release version. Now, a couple of quick things before we dig in. First, sort of an overall summary. There's enormous opportunity in the industry right now for entrepreneurial dentists that move quickly to take advantage of these opportunities. And I say move quickly because these opportunities will not last forever. The flip side, dentistry is rapidly becoming an industry of haves and have-nots, and those who don't make appropriate moves now could find themselves and their profitability being severely squeezed over the next few years. I've made a slideshow, much of it which came from the conference, available to download. It's all in the show notes, the download section. You don't need to follow along, and I'll walk you through every number in plain language, but if you like seeing the data with your own eyes, you can go grab it, download it, and you can kind of follow along as I go. And the next thing is, fair warning, I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you today. I'm going to keep it conversational. I won't read you a spreadsheet, but I want you walking away with a real picture, not a vibe. And I want to be crystal clear on something. We've been tracking all of this, like I said, for years and briefing our clients on this to give them an edge. To that end, I told our clients at the Owners Conference that this is the time that they've been preparing for. These trends are now starting to really bloom, for lack of a better word. Again, incredible opportunity on the horizons for doctors who position themselves correctly. And like I've been saying for years, maybe the biggest opportunity I've seen in private dentistry in my career. And I'd venture to say, maybe even in the last 50 years. I'm not that old, folks. There's incredible opportunity on the horizon for doctors who position themselves correctly. Maybe the biggest opportunity I've seen in my career, and I'd venture to say in the last 50 years. And in order to make it work, you need a specific game plan, which I'm going to give you information on how to get towards the end of this episode. All right, so let's get into it. So we're going to start off with the supply of dentists. Let's start with the dumbest, simplest question. How many dentists are there? How many dentists does it look like we're going to have over the next 10 plus years? Because everything else hangs off of this number. All right, so currently, according to the ADA, in 2024, we had 202,485 dentists. Now, this is everybody, dentists, dental specialists, including forensic dentists, dentists working in the public sector, etc. All right? 202,485. How does it relate to prior years? Well, that is 181 doctors higher than in 2023. And again, I don't have 2025 numbers because usually there's a bit of a lag, all right? And roughly about 160,000-ish of these are GPs, the rest are specialists and whatnot. So we went from 202,304 in 2023 to 202,485 in 2024. Not a huge growth. As a matter of fact, the supply has been relatively, in the big picture, static for the last 5 or 6 years. Now here's where it gets interesting when you start digging into the demographics with relation to doctors. So currently, 34.2% of all doctors are 55 and over. 34.2%, all right? And roughly 24 point, I'm just gonna say 25%, okay, folks? Otherwise these points I think are gonna make everybody freak out. Let's just say 25% are over 60, we estimate. So that means about 50,000 doctors are over the age of 60, and 34% of that 200 and some odd thousand are over 55. So the reason I bring that up is, what is the average retirement age in dentistry? It's 68.7. Used to be lower, used to be closer to 65. Now it's 68.7. What this tells you is you have a large portion of, over the next 10 years, you have a large portion of the profession coming in for a landing, where they're going to be, sort of phasing out of the profession. And again, I'm not saying this to practice ageism. I'm not a spring chicken. That's not the point. But if you were to ask me, I don't know, today, Jeff, how much longer do you plan on doing what you're doing? I'm not going to say 30 years. If you'd asked me when I was 30, I would say 30 years. So that's just something to keep in mind. We have a large portion of the profession moving towards retirement age, and that I'm not a big problem with that, but that means that they're not going to be in their practices for forever. And on top of that, most of the older, actually, we picked a new word to use at the owners conference for this because we thought older sounded bad. I was personally offended by it. We said experienced doctors. Most of the experienced doctors own practices. The majority of ownership is concentrated in the higher age demographic. So now, if that tells us this, where do we stand with relation to new dentists coming into the profession? Well, right now we have 78 dental schools. And we're projecting, based on the data we were able to gather, we project that by 2030, we may have between 1 and 3 more. Because, obviously, starting a dental school is not something that you do overnight. It takes some time. It takes 5 to 7 years to get one going. Based on what's in progress now, you might have anywhere from 79 to 81 dental schools by the year 2030. So when we take a look at all of that and, school capacity, class capacity, what do we estimate between now and 2033 the number of new doctors will be? We estimate close to 73,000. Close to 73,000 new doctors will be coming into the profession over the next, 7 years. All right? And I have projections in the slide, so I'm not going to go over year by year. This year we project 7,150. That isn't the point, right? The reason I bring this up, so you got new doctors coming in, and you have experienced doctors that are eventually going to be hitting their retirement horizon. So to kind of give us some information on how this works, so we can kind of project, okay, with the doctors going out and the doctors coming in, how many doctors are we going to end up with left over the next, 3, 4, 5, 10 years? We have a factor called an exit rate. So what's an exit rate? Basically, you take a group of dentists, right? And you go, okay, between this age and this age, what percentage of those doctors are going to leave the profession over the next 5 years? And the ADA has this information. All right, they have this information. And it comes from a publication called the U.S. Dentist Retirement and Career Span. It's in 2024 from the ADA Health Policy Institute. A lot of this information came from them. So I'm just going to give you an idea of what these exit rates are so you can kind of think with this. So up to the age of 54, a doctor, when they graduate school and they get licensed, 26, 27, whatever, up to the age of 54, over a 5-year period, between 2.8 and 4.1% of those folks will leave the profession. So if you were to get a group of doctors, up to the age of 54, you put 100 of them in a room, you came back 5 years, we wouldn't leave them in the room for 5 years, but you came back 5 years later, you had this meeting, and then 5 years later you came back, anywhere from 3 to 4 of them will have left dentistry. So you'd have 97 left. Obviously, as these numbers, these ages go up, as they become more experienced, these exit rate percentages go up. So between the ages of 55 and 64, that exit rate goes up to almost 20%. So again, you take 100 doctors, you come back 5 years later, 20 of them have left the profession. You get between the ages of 65 to 69, now you have about 43% have left the profession. Between 70 and 74, 63%. 75 to 84, you're at 80%, 85 plus 92. Now, here's the only thing I'm going to say. I had projected these numbers earlier based on just U.S. demographics. And I had especially the upper bracket over the age of 70, a lot higher than the ADA had. So I'm using the ADA's numbers here, which are more conservative. But, what they're saying here essentially is a doctor who's 85 years old, if you have a group of doctors who are 85 and still practicing, 92 of them will retire over 5 years. I think that number is closer to 98, 99. At least I know it would be for me. If I were 85, I could love dentistry. Maybe I maintain my license, but I'm not working a 30, 40-hour week schedule. I'm sorry. Okay? So if you take into consideration the number of new doctors we're projecting and the number of doctors we project will exit the profession, what does that do to overall dentist supply over the next, between now and 2033? That's the horizon I'm using. Well, we project by 2028, the number of doctors is going to go down. Right now it's, 202,000, roughly 500. We project by 2028, that number is going to be closer to 195,000 total in the United States. By 2033, that number should slightly rebound to 205,000. And this sort of fits with what the ADA has been saying. The ADA has been putting out, because the ADA puts out great numbers, right? But some of the info, I think, has not been highlighted. So the ADA has been bringing up, look, by the year 2040, based on our projections, we're going to have a lot more doctors. Based on these numbers, that is absolutely true. New schools are coming together. It's moving. But between now and then, there's going to be a dip as the retirements continue, which they were originally projected to be done by 2025. They're not. And then eventually it will start to rebound by 2033. But if you look at it, if we've gone from, 201,000 doctors in 2020 to 205,000 in 2033, that's not a huge change, considering the population change, etc. So it's not a hugely growing area at this point. It will eventually grow, but it's not growing as fast as you might want or think. And keep in mind, these models can be changed or materially affected by, dental school enrollments going down. These are projected enrollments, which are pretty high. More doctors retiring, people getting relicensed and coming back, and internationally trained dentists, right, which usually runs anywhere from 500 to 900 entering the profession per year. That could change. So we don't know. These are projections, right? We're doing our best with the information we have in past trends, but these are projections. So now, why is this a big deal? You would think, okay, at first blush, this is great, right? There's going to be not a lot of doctors. And in a way, that is true. That is true. If I'm in an area and, I have a certain skill set, and there's not a lot of me or people who do what I do, then I have a degree of exclusivity. If you you double the number of people with that skill set, it makes it more difficult. And that doesn't make it horrible to get business, but it makes it not as easy as if there were less of me. The reason this is a big deal, specifically with relation to private dentistry, has to do with ownership. So let's get into that. I call it the ownership crisis. So right now, let's look at the overall statistics according to the ADA. In 2005, 84.7%. And I think I'm going to start estimating because my editors hate it when I do the points. Let's just say 85%. I'm going to round up and down where you're supposed to. In 2005, 85% of doctors owned a practice. So if you had 100,000 dentists, 85,000 owned a practice. By 2021, that ownership rate had dropped to 73%. And by 2023, it had dropped to 72.5. I'm sorry, I threw a point in there. So now, if these trends continue, based on the prior decline, right? If these trends continue based on the prior decline, we estimate by 2028 that number should be closer to 69%. And by 2033, that number should be closer to 66%. So we've gone from 85% in 2005. We're estimating we're going to be closer to 66% of doctors owning a practice by 2033. So now, why are we losing this ownership? Well, it's because more experienced, meaning older doctors, own their practices. Younger doctors are not buying. So where are they going? Well, let's first look at DSOs. Right now, 16% of U.S. dentists were DSO affiliated in 2024. That was up from 7% or 7.5% back in 2015. 1 in 4 dentists within 10 years of graduation are DSO affiliated. And I want you to keep one thing in mind. The DSOs are heavily concentrated in urban markets, in cities. They're not in rural areas. Just put that in your pocket for a second because this is going to become important later. There's not going to be a test. And 32% of dental school seniors in 2024 planned to join a DSO. Now, to give you an idea of how that's accelerated, that was 12% in 2015, 30% in 2020. And it actually, I think, was 33% in 2033. So it's actually gone down by a percentage point, which is good. But still, you're looking at roughly 1 out of 3. So now, this is where it starts to become problematic. I have a graph in here that I do recommend you look at. It's from the ADA, Health Policy Institute, and we projected it forward based on what's currently going on. And it's practice ownership declining over time. And it has each age bracket, under 30, 30 to 34, 35 to 44, and so on, up to 65 plus. If you look, you'll see that in 2005, the average doctor under 30, or the average under 30 was 25% of doctors owned a practice. So in 2005, 25% of doctors owned a practice. In 2005, under 30. In 2005, doctors 30 to 34, over 50% owned a practice. Those numbers now, it's 8.8% for doctors under 30, and a little over 20%, or 20, it's close to 25%, or I'm sorry, rather, and a little over 30% for doctors 30 to 34. So, whereas you go to the upper ranges of ages, the 45 to 64 group, that number has stayed pretty consistent. There you have 90+% or the high 80s owning a practice, and that has not really changed that drastically. So most of the ownership is concentrating in the older and more experienced brackets. So now, let's look at what's happening with practices in general. How many dental practices are there in the United States? There's about 135,000 total offices, not dentists, but actual locations. And we estimate, and this is tough to figure out, but we estimated roughly that 13 to 19,000 of them are DSO offices. The reason why is DSOs, defining a DSO is very nebulous. And so, like, you might be a DSO if you have 3 offices as far as this statistic goes, all right? But so you got 135,000 offices, and 13 to 19 are DSO offices. So that means we have about 116 to 122,000 that are not DSO, all right? So now, think with that for a second. If we take what's currently existing, you remove the DSOs from the equation, right? And you look at the number of the doctors by age group that own a practice, right? So, the 55 to 64, you have 90% own a practice. And you look at who owns practices in the United States right now. I have a whole breakdown of this. I'm not going to read every column here. But the point I want to bring up is currently close to 50,000 of these 120,000 locations are owned by doctors 55 and over. I'm pausing intentionally. Close to 50,000 of these 120,000 locations are owned by doctors 55 and over, which means they're 14 years or less away from the average retirement age, okay? And if you were to look at right now, as of 2024, how many offices are owned by doctors under 30, we estimate it's like 1,100. 30 to 34, like 5,000. So, and it's funny, there was a story, I forget where it was on the ADA site, where it talked about ownership is still happening, but it's delayed. Yeah, that's true, but new doctors are not buying practices. So I want you to kind of imagine this for a second. You have all these offices, roughly 120,000 offices. And over the next, 5, 10, 15 years, whoever owns that practice is going to want to leave. They're going to either sell, or they're going to want to sell, most likely, because most doctors would like to get some value out of the practice that they started. Well, the problem is the buying pool doesn't exist. The buyers that were supposed to come in and buy these offices aren't buying practices. Ownership in the under 45 crowd has plummeted. So now put those two things together. Where are these offices going to go? Over the next 10 years or 8 years, we estimate 36,000 practices are going to be sold. Where are they all going to go? Well, some of them will be bought by DSOs, but they're not. I mean, again, I hate to generalize an entire industry, but the DSO industry is not exactly blowing it up right now. They're not doing as well as they were, let's say, 35 years ago. And DSOs have a very specific target when they buy a practice. They're not buying a practice that's doing $500,000 a year with 4 operatories. So some will be bought by DSOs. Some will be bought by new doctors coming into the profession, right? But there's not enough new doctors based on these percentages to buy all of them. So we estimate, this is sort of the punchline, we estimate that we're going to lose over the next 5 years, 4 to 5 years, 10,000 locations. They're just going to go away, meaning the charts will be sold to another practice, or the doctor's going to turn in their keys to the landlord. And then if you follow that forward, based on current ownership trends, by 2033, We could go to 104,000 practices. So we'll go from 120-ish now to 110 in 2028 to 103 in 2033. Now get what I mean by that, meaning 17,000 practices or 16,000 practices by 2033 will just disappear. They're going to go away. They'll be consolidated with other offices. You're going to have less location, less access in private dentistry. Because here's the messed up thing. Normally, when you have a growing profession or a healthy profession, you would expect to see, the passing of the torch, right? Here comes in the new doctors, and they're buying the old generation or the prior generation's practices and continuing these practices. I know plenty of practices that are third, fourth generation. They've been around since 1910 and whatever, right? They have new equipment though, at least. But that's going to stop happening as frequently as it had, because what's happening now is you would expect ownership to be concentrated or begin to be concentrated in the younger demo. What's happening now is it's being concentrated in the older or more experienced demographic. So if you take the current ownership percentages, right, the share of ownership of offices owned currently in the United States by doctors 45 and over is 71%. We're projecting by 2028 that could be 73%, by 2033, 78%, because young doctors aren't buying. And, people will say, well, why are younger doctors not buying? If you're a younger doctor, maybe you could tell me. I've talked to some, I've heard differing answers. Some, they don't feel comfortable being on their own yet. Some have a lot of debt service because they have a gazillion dollars in student debt. Student debt is, the dental school tuition is crazy now compared to what it used to be. And I did an episode a couple of years ago, I think, where I pointed up, if you compared the amount of student debt a doctor walked out with to what they could expect as first year income, that used to be under 100%, meaning a doctor could walk out of dental school and have maybe 100,000, 80,000 in debt, but they could expect to make 120, 140 in their first year. So that wasn't so bad. Whereas now, dental schools on the low end, I have a relative who just went to dental school. They went to an out-of-state school. So their first year tuition is 100,000, and second year, third, the next 3 years are 60. So just tuition alone is 280. Which that's low. I've seen 350. I've seen 500. Saw a story on NYU. It was like 700 if you included interest on loans and things like this. So if I'm walking out with $600,000-$700,000 in debt, and you go, hey Jeff, and I feel like I need to get a bit more seasoned. And you go, hey Jeff, why don't you buy this office for $500,000-$700,000? I'm probably not going to do that because I'm just not comfortable. Plus, I got to service my student debt. So that could be it. It could be any number of things, but regardless, they're not buying. So what that means, or potentially, is that 10,000 practices could disappear by 2028. They're going to give the keys back or turn over or sell the charts, and 17,000 could end up disappearing by 2033. Yes, some people will sell, but a lot of people will not be able to. So what that tells you is we're going to have a buyer's market for dental practices. So if you're looking at acquiring practices rather, great time. If you're a new doctor and you're thinking, hey, I want to buy a practice and get started, you've never picked a better time. The only piece of advice I'm going to give you, if you're a younger doctor who's looking at buying a practice, or you could be even a more experienced doctor looking at buying a practice, don't go out on a limb and spend $1 billion. You don't have to. I've seen people who have $750, $800 for a startup. I wouldn't do that. You can find a place that's doing $300-$400 a year. It's got 4 chairs. Maybe the carpets are the wrong color and you don't like the paint on the wall and the equipment needs some updates. Buy it for $300-$400 and scale it. You're not going to walk in with a gun to your head debt-wise, and you can actually scale the place and make it do well. All right, so now you think we've got the supply is staying relatively static. We have an ownership issue that we've just discussed, but the average doctor is doing okay financially, right? Not true. And here's what's weird. Dental spending over the last 26 years has almost doubled. It's gone from per year. In 2000, it was $107 billion. And as of 2025, it was 108, or 2024 rather, it was $189 billion, dental spending. And consumer dental spending is actually up 8% since 2020. So money's being put into dentistry. But there was there's something called Trends in Dental Income, Revenue, and Hours Work. It was a publication by the ADA Health Policy Institute, where they looked at revenue per dentist and net income per dentist. And this is where it gets interesting. So in 2000, there's 2 time periods, 2015 to 2019 and 2020 to 2024. These are our two time periods. So let's start with revenue per dentist. In 15 to 19, the revenue per dentist was about $707,000 per year. From 2020 to 2024, it's closer to $698,000, down by about $8,500. Expenses per dentists from 15 to 19 was $469,000 roughly. 2020 to 2024, $482,000. That increased by 3%. If you do the math, revenue minus expenses, the net income per dentist in the United States from 15 to 19 on average went from $230,000 in 15 to 19 down to $200,000 in 2020 to 2024, which that in and of itself is not great, right? It's down by 13%. But let's compare something. What was the inflationary rate during those periods? Well, from 15 to 19, it was 10% over a 5-year period. From 2020 to 24, you know what I'm about to say, it was high, it was 22%. So effectively, doctors were taking a 13% pay cut in the face of 22% inflation. If you do the math, that's roughly a 35% pay cut. And if you look at the impact on purchasing power in plain terms, let's say you had a GP earning $230 in 2019 that had a certain lifestyle. That same lifestyle, if you adjust for inflation, now costs $280,000. But the average GP is only earning $200. So that's like almost a $7,000 gap per month. That's a mortgage payment, a kid's tuition, 2 car payments gone. And this is what's happening to the average doctor, you see. And why is this happening? It's not, there's more spending occurring in dentistry. So what's going on here? It's being eaten up by expenses as well as fee control. So we've talked about this before on the podcast, but while inflation's been going up, I remember when I first looked, I'm always too early to this stuff. I did my first inflation video in 2021. Oh my gosh, inflation's 5%, right? Anyway, nobody watched. But the point being is, while inflation was raging, I remember thinking at the time, what are insurance companies going to do? I bet they're going to be jerks and just do nothing. That was the worst I thought that would happen. Little did I know. So, according to information from the ADA, dental PPO reimbursement rates between 2021 and 2025, 60% of doctors surveyed saw no change. They didn't go up, they didn't go down, while inflation was 22%. Thank you, insurance companies. 25% of dentists saw rates cut. So, yes, inflation's going up, and what you're getting is going down. Many of you have told me about this, anecdotally, you've told me this. And 7% saw somewhat of an increase. Yay, right? So, if you do the calculus here, you have inflation going up, reimbursements going down. It's basic math, right? Expenses going up, revenue staying stagnant or going down. So then the net result is, less profit, right? And one thing I think I should just throw out there, there's this myth that 80% of Americans have dental insurance. The actual reality is closer to 61% have real year-round private dental insurance. The reason I bring this up is, we teach our clients not to be insurance-driven, right? Like, okay, I'm only going to do what insurance covers. Oh my gosh, you can work with insurance. It's just another means of paying. Like a patient financing. It's just another means of paying. I know patients get attached to it. Some do, some don't, some more than others. But it's not as high as you thought. It's not 80%, it's 61%. 40% of people have no coverage. But either way, even if you're out of network, there's no reason, okay, why you can still take somebody who's got network insurance and just their reimbursement rate is lower and they're having to have a higher copay. A lot of our clients do this. And we teach them how to get out of network. But last couple economics point here. Staff I know is pressure, so I have this in the slideshow, so I'll just bring it up. Current unemployment rate hasn't really drastically changed. It's around 4%. But what's interesting is jobs per unemployed person. If you remember back in 22, there was like 2 jobs for every 1 unemployed person. So for employees, they could kind of pick and choose where they wanted to go. That is now 1 job for every 1.09 people. All right. So we're in a situation where the labor market, especially for non-technical staff, maybe non-providers, hygienists, assistants, associates, has cooled off. It's much easier to hire now than it was 5-6 years ago or even 3 years ago. So, which brings me to hygienists. And, I brought this up before, hygienists and assistants, but just as a little bit of an update here. Currently, by survey, from 2022 to 2024, doctors 87% said in 2022 that it was difficult to find an assistant. That's now down to 70%. So assistants supply is starting to loosen up a bit. Hygienists are another story. That's barely moved. In 2022, 95% of people said it was tough to find hygienists. 91% said in 2024. So the hygiene supply has gone down. And I've brought this up before because we're not making enough. We've got a few more hygienists. The supply has rebounded since COVID. But the biggest problem is that 53% of hygienists work full-time, 54%. So when you're adding one hygienist, it's not like adding an associate doctor who's full-time. They may only be working 1 or 2 days a week. Current hygiene supply is going up, but it's still not quite where it needs to be. We project it needs to be about 12,000 new hygienists per year to kind of make it work for dentistry to have enough. It's currently around 9,700. So that's sort of the state of things economically, which brings me to DSOs. So corporate dentistry, or DSOs, was a big concern for a lot of guys back in 2010, 15, etc. And then it seemed like they really came on hard in the 2020s because there was a lot of easy money flowing around. That flow, that growth, that expansion has slowed down considerably. So where are we with DSOs right now? Well, right now, there are 200 to 250 true DSOs in the U.S. estimated. In other words, with 5 or more locations, all right? Less than 60 of these have over 50 locations. 20 to 25 of these have 100 plus locations. We estimate that 10,000 plus practices are owned by the top 50 DSOs combined. All right, so 130 of these DSOs, of these 200 to 250, are backed by private equity. I'm not going to get into a whole thing on this. Private equity, hedge funds, big money, right? Are backing these. They're investing in these, which actually is more than any other healthcare sector. All right. So who owns these DSOs? So 9 of the top 10 DSOs in the United States are owned or backed by private equity. 27 of the top 30 are backed by private equity. About 84% of major DSO locations. Now, the reason this has become an issue, and I've seen this happen with our clients, because part of the problem with our clients is they grow. We've doctors doing $1 million a month or 1.2 a month, or private dentistry, great practices, right? Or 500 a month, 400 a month. It's not uncommon for an MGE client to be doing that well, all right? So part of the issue when you have a practice doing $4, $5, $6 million a year is if you want to sell, who is going to buy it? The average individual dentist can't purchase that practice, and then the valuation methodology changed since private equity entered the dental space. It used to be, you may have heard me say this before, the standard in dentistry for years, since I've been in the industry, was 70% of last year's collections was how much a practice would go for. So if you went to a doctor in your town, you're a new dentist, or you're a newer dentist, and you want to own your own place, that doctor did $500,000 the prior year, you would buy that practice for $350,000. Now, you might pay a little less if the equipment is older, or the doctor is a bit of a fire sale, they want to get rid of it. Or you might pay a little more if they had newer equipment, etc. Or there was a lot of people buying practices in that area. I remember 2006 or 8, 6 or 7 actually, talking to a doctor in Orange County who'd paid 100% of last year's collections for her practice. So, and I know in Canada it's closer to 100%. But the point being is that used to be how practices changed hands. A doctor wanted to retire, they sold it for 70% of last year's collections, right? It was very, very simple. Private equity entered the scene, and the whole valuation methodology changed, and it became a multiple of EBITDA, which, I'm not going to get into what that is. Let's just keep it simple. It's sort of like profit. And it became a multiple of profit. So if your practice profit last year was $500,000, and the DSO was going to pay a 5x multiple of EBITDA, again, EBITDA and profit are not the exact same thing, but there's a lot of similarities. You would get $2.5 million, you see? And you notice that has nothing to do with how much the practice collected. That's become the new valuation methodology for the larger practices when DSOs are buying. We had a client who sold their practice that was doing $4 million a year for $7 million. Had they sold that practice 10 years ago to just another independent buyer, it would have sold for 2.8. Do you see? So that became the major difference. Now, usually what these DSOs would do is early on, when you get DSOs like Heartland or some of the early ones, they would just buy the practice outright. They would ask the doctor owner to stay on for anywhere from as low as 2 years, I've seen, to up to 4 or 5, and then the doctor would leave. That was the norm. all right? When Heartland was buying it. Sorry, I'll say it again, Claudia. That was the norm. Well, now what's happening is DSOs will come in. This is the more recent common structure I've seen of these deals, is they'll come in, they'll pay you 70% of the total value, meaning like, let's say your practice is worth $10 million. They're going to cut you a check for $7 million. They're going to leave you with 20% of the practice. And then that other 10%, because 70% you get the check for, 20% you're keeping, that other 10% becomes an investment in the DSO, with the idea that if this DSO blows up and does well, you're going to make a lot more money than you would have made otherwise, because the DSO all of a sudden was worth whatever, 100 million, and now it's worth 500 million. Well, you're going to benefit from that because you have 10% of your practice's value was invested in the DSO. They call it the second bite. The second bite. Now, the way the DSOs would pay out on these second bites is by recapitalizing. So again, to keep it simple, some of you know what this is, but just let's keep it simple. So what's recapitalization? When a private equity firm puts more money into a company or sells it to another investor to keep growing or cash out. That's recapitalization. Because normally private equity, their model is they don't want to hold on to a business usually for more than 5 years, sometimes up to 7. That's rare. But they buy a business, they take the money out that they're going to take out, they maximize the profit, and then they sell it to either another private equity firm or someone else. That's generally how private equity works, all right? So recapitalization is where someone buys part of the company or they sell it to another investor and then they can cash out. It's like hitting the financial refresh button. And for DSOs, these deals pay off old debt, fund new acquisitions. If they have an investor, maybe they're not buying the entire DSO, but they're buying part of it, and it rewards investors. And basically, so let's say I'm a DSO, I'm worth 30 million. So I sell a portion of my DSO. I use that money to buy other practices. By buying these other practices, I increase the, on paper at least, value of my DSO. So then the next person who invests is going to be paying a higher price. Do you see? Again, I don't want to get too crazy with this, but I want you to get the idea. So if I'm a dentist and I owned part of 10% of my practice value went into this DSO and another person comes in and buys part of the DSO, well, now I get to cash out with more money. That's the basic idea. All right, that was the basic idea how it worked. What we're seeing with clients now is that second bite they were supposed to get from the DSO is not happening, or it's being delayed because some of these DSOs are not doing as well as one would like for them to do. Now, the basic problem with DSOs is many of them are in heavy, heavy debt, billions of dollars of debt. All right, and when you have debt in a company, you're a big company and you're taking on debt for acquisition, you have to pay that debt back. Well, how much interest you pay on that debt depends on how your debt is rated. Okay? You've probably heard about this before. Some of you have, some of you haven't, with bond ratings. A bond is rated AAA or, A1, or there's different rating systems. Some DSOs bond ratings are not very high, so they would be paying higher interest debt. Like, for instance, there's a PE group called KKR, all right, that owns most, if not all, owns part of Heartland. I don't know what percentage of it they own. Heartland is $2 billion in debt, okay? Because the debt rating is not super high, they're paying a lot of interest on that debt. And again, I'm just saying this anecdotally. I haven't had a lot of clients that Heartland has approached in the last, I haven't actually heard of Heartland in our client base in the last 5 years. But if I had to guess, they're probably one of the more healthy ones because they've been around for a while. I also know they weren't paying as much as some of these other ones, and I think that's part of what happened. You had DSOs entering the scene, or I heard people telling me, oh, they're giving me 10 times multiple of EBITDA, or 12x multiple, like this was being promised, right? And then you had, if you guys remember these, what they used to call roll-ups, where you'd have 10 offices, 10 different doctors get together and say, hey, we're all one DSO, let's see if we can get more money. Well, private equity got wise to that, right? And decided maybe this isn't a good idea. When private equity buys a practice, or a DSO, a private equity-backed DSO buys a practice, they want to own all the underlying assets. They may not own the charts, but they want to own the chairs and the space, etc., so that they actually own something. Now, part of the problem with a DSO in my mind, and this is just from having worked with private dental practitioners for 30 years, is, a lot of what makes the practice go is the dentist. If you have a practice that's doing $4 million a year, and a lot of that production is coming from the owner doctor who's really invested, who built that place. If you remove that doctor, it's very difficult to maintain not just the customer service and quality, but just the overall revenue. It's difficult because that was the person who was driving it. So one of the bigger issues DSOs have, is turnover. Right now, 51% of new dentists and DSOs plan on leaving by survey, versus in a non-DSO practice, these are associate doctors, only 7% plan on leaving. It's a 7% turnover gap, all right? And then the last problem with the DSO is, or DSOs rather, is the fact that there was a lot of free money, interest rates were low, there was money floating around everywhere, and the whole idea of buying these places up heavily was in the 2020s, has sort of kind of gone down a bit because not everything is as rosy as it appeared to be. So private equity is not as heavily invested or aggressive as they were, let's say, 5 years ago. So the money is drying up a bit. So those recapitalizations aren't happening as expected. Exits are getting delayed. You see, like 37 private equity-backed DSOs are 5+ years past the expected recapitalization. 17 of those are 7 years past. So dentists who sold with the idea of getting that second bite when the recapitalization was supposed to happen, I've talked to a few who aren't getting it. And just to give you an idea, there's a quote here from a guy named Eric Yetter from Focus Investment Banking is where the quote came from. Something called the Dental Transactions Update in June of 2025. It says many of the private equity-backed DSOs are preparing for their own sale process. Okay, which fine. This creates an incentive to grow before sale, as increasing the DSO's EBITDA through acquisition will likely increase its transaction value. So some of these offices, and I actually talked to a guy when they had their DSO meeting with all the other offices, this was the strategy. To increase their on-paper value, their quote-unquote value, they're buying more offices. The operational procedure, in my mind, this is Jeff's opinion, is I think we have two problems. One, sure, they may operate efficiently, they have economy of scale, they can keep their expenses down because they have 100 offices buying supplies or whatever. But it's not the same as a privately owned practice, number one, from just there's not someone necessarily on the scene as invested in the practice as it would be with a privately owned practice. And the other bigger problem in my mind is the owner doctors eventually bail in a lot of these offices and they won't be able to maintain the numbers. So in addition to these practices from these more experienced, older doctors that are going to just end up on the market, I think you're going to end up with DSO practices on the market. This is just my 2 cents down the road, as some of these more recent comers to the game who maybe weren't as judicious in how they threw their money around end up not doing as well. I think you'll still end up with some of the bigger players around, but it's not as big of a thing. It was supposed to be this humongous threat that dentistry was going to go corporate. I don't see it. I just don't. I don't see that this is where it's going to go long term, because it isn't being sustained now. All right. So what does this all look like then? If we project this out into the future, where is this all going? Well, let's take a look. So we have a drop in supply of dentists through 2028, and then a slight rebound by 2033 projected. We project that 36,000 practices will be on the market over the next decade as the top end of the age demographic retires. Younger doctors aren't buying practices the way they did 20 plus years ago. So we estimate that approximately 17,000 of these practices that will end up on the market will find no buyer. We called it orphan practices. They're just going to either sell the charts or close the office. All right. We have a situation where revenues are down despite increased spending in the dental space. And we have a net 35% pay cut in the average dentist purchasing power between 2021 and 2024. And a lot of that is pushed by fee suppression by networks, or by plans rather. 25% of doctors surveyed saw their reimbursement rates cut. 60% saw zero raise, against over that time period from 2020 to now, 26% inflation, right? And so I don't know where this is all going to go. Now, an interesting sort of, whatever you want to call it, canary in the coal mine here was, and I think I mentioned this last year because it was in the process at the time, Delta Dental bought a DSO called Cherry Tree. Delta Dental of Wisconsin acquired Cherry Tree Dental, which is a regional DSO. So for the first time, a dominant dental insurer in a state directly owns the practices it pays. Now, of course, they've come out and said there's no conflict of interest or whatever, which, I'll believe that when I see it. Maybe I'm being a bit controversial when I say that. The ADA's response to this was, they said, when an insurance company becomes both healthcare provider and insurance payer, questions arise regarding potential conflict of interest. From a business standpoint, dental insurance company seeks to minimize cost and maximize profit. So we got a sternly worded letter, right? But why is this a big deal if this pattern becomes a thing? Well, Delta Dental is the largest dental insurance network in the United States. 39 member companies, 85 million people covered, 157,000 employer groups. If they own the practices or own practices and set the reimbursement rates, what happens to fees for everyone else? Now, this whole thing did trigger an investigation by the FTC, or request for investigation by the FTC and DOJ, right, Department of Justice. But you can kind of see this for a second. And I wondered about this. Why wouldn't, if I'm an insurance company, why not just cut out the middleman, have the dentist work for me? They do it with lawyers. Your malpractice company, most likely, if you're talking to an attorney, they may be paying a separate attorney, or they may employ that attorney. Why have to deal with another company and pay a premium? Do you see? And who knows, this Delta thing might be a bit of a shot across the bow. It's a shot. They're trying something. Obviously, this is quite a gutsy move, in my opinion, on their part. It's the first time, to my knowledge, this has ever happened where an insurance carrier went direct to buy practices. So, depending on how that shakes out, which we'll know over the next 6 months to a year, most likely, you'd end up with a situation with the same entity controlling the insurance contract, the reimbursement rate, the practice receiving the patient, and the patient's plan choice. So, if that model were to multiply, let's say this is successful and more insurance companies do this, what would that mean for the average network-dependent dentist? You see, and this is something that I'd want to think about, because if I'm network-dependent, this is a problem for me, whereas if I'm not, that's a whole other story. Now, you remember earlier on in the episode, I talked about urban versus rural doctors. Sorry, I have problems saying the word rural. Okay. So, interesting statistic for you, because generally speaking, new graduates tend to gravitate towards metro areas, urban areas. So first I want to give you a number. If you go to an urban area, the average urban area, city, there's 65 dentists for every 100,000 people. Okay? In rural areas, that number is 33 dentists for every 100,000 people, and it's actually been declining since 2015. If I were a newer doctor and I was looking to buy a practice, I would definitely go outside of a city. That would make complete sense to me. And the joke is, for the most part, everybody in the United States is not far from, they're an hour to maybe 2 hours away from what would be considered a rural area. I'm in the Tampa Bay area, so if I drive an hour and a half north, I'm not in the sticks, but I'm not in a big city area. To begin with, Tampa's not a huge city, but if you drive an hour north, you're out in a rural area. That isn't that far. So if I were, say my main office was in Tampa, if I were looking to expand to a second location, I'd probably be going in those areas because there's less dentists per population. Again, can you be successful if you're in a highly competitive market? Absolutely. Our clients do it all the time. But, if I could go to a less competitive market, why the heck not, right? So, we say that new grads gravitate urban because 31% of dentists under 5 years out of school are DSO affiliated, which are primarily concentrated in metro markets. Now, some interesting economics when you take a rural versus an urban practice. So earlier on, I went over the average practice, and I went over the idea of revenue, how it had gone down from 2015 to 19 versus 2020 to 2024. And I was going over average in the United States. Well, now I have this broken down by rural practice and urban practice. So I have the 2015 to 2019 period versus the 2020 to 2024 period. This gets really interesting. So let's look at our first metric, which is revenue per dentist. In urban areas, revenue per dentist in 2015 to 19 was $703,000. That number in 2020 to 2024 went down to $695,000. It's down by 1.2%. In rural areas, the number's actually gone up. Revenue has gone up, $737,000 to $782,000. It's actually gone up by 6.1%. But here's the kicker. Let's look at expenses per dentist. If I go to an urban area, it's gone from $464,000 to $480,000, which is up by 3.4%, which leaves a net of roughly $200,000. Okay, we'll get into the net here in a second. Sorry, I jumped ahead. If I go to a rural area, expenses per dentist has gone up astronomically. It's gone from an average of $472,000 in 15 to 19 to $550,000 in 2020 to 2024. It's up by 16.4%. So while rural dentists are making more money, the more revenues coming in, their expenses have gone up astronomically. Let's look at net income. Net income for urban doctors has gone from 225 to 200. So again, they're feeling that bite we were talking about earlier in the episode. Net income in rural areas has gone from 251 to 210. So rural practices generate about $87,000, almost $90,000 more revenue than urban practices, yet the net is dropping for each. And look at why is the net dropping? Without getting into a big thing on this, if my expenses are going up, like let's just take a look at something for a second. If I own a restaurant, all right, you probably know somebody who owns a restaurant or some type of business, a retail business. If my suppliers start charging me more for, meat and baked goods and soda and whatever, they're charging me more. What am I going to do? I'm going to pass that on to the consumer. So if I'm getting charged more for Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola is going to go up in my restaurant as far as the price goes. The problem is if you are 70% in network, yes, your expenses are going up, and that's just a fact of life right now, but you cannot raise your fees. And that is a huge problem because you can't respond effectively. You're sort of trapped. And if I were to look at this, the rural versus urban and the expenses going up, yeah, we knew expenses were going to go up, but revenues have now gone up in step with that because they can't raise their fees. All right? All right, so the next thing, we're going over what's going to happen. So one thing we hadn't taken a look at here is, I went over that 36,000 practices should be for sale over the next 10 years. Well, we estimate that 16 to 17,000 of those practices will not sell. They're just going to go away. Now, if we say the average practice has 1,000 to 2,000 charts, what does that mean in actual patient numbers? That's 16 to 32 million patients in transition over the next 10 years. So basically what that means is we're going to end up with less availability for patients. Sure, some of these practices are going to absorb charts and they'll find other dentists, etc. But you're going to end up with this huge transition in many cases where they can't actually, you're going to have people who don't have a dentist near them. And this is why I brought this up as a huge opportunity for MGE clients. You're going to have these practices sort of vanishing. And we've been talking with our clients about this for the last decades, and many of our clients are taking advantage of this. MGE clients know how to scale. They can pick up additional practices for a reasonable investment without competing with DSOs. And this is an important thing. If you're going to buy a practice, a second location, or heck, I would even say for your first location, don't go spending $1 billion on this. It's a buyer's market right now. It will be for the next 5 or 6 years, maybe 7. I would be looking at practices that are maybe they have potential or upside, 4 or 5 chairs, and they've got some activity and some charts. Maybe I have to update the equipment, and maybe there's shag carpet in the reception area, and there's wood paneling. It's ugly, but who cares? Those are cosmetic fixes and chairs you can get for next to nothing now. I see people getting chairs for $8,000 with an in-chair delivery system, right? And a free Cavitron. So I would be buying practices that are doing 3, 4, 500,000 a year because I'm getting those cheap and I can scale those things. And this is what our clients are doing. I have one client who bought a practice that was doing $350 a year. That practice collected $600,000  2 months or 3 months ago in a month. So the point being is you can scale these things, okay? So MG clients know how to scale. They can pick up practices for a reasonable investment. And what this does that I really like is it takes responsibility for these practices, doesn't let them vanish. It takes responsibility for these patients and potentially associate doctors, so not having to go into a DSO type environment, and it provides an excellent career trajectory. Now, on the flip side of this, if nobody grabs these practices, if they just sort of vanish, if nothing fills the gap, let's look at what we might be looking at. Again, nobody really knows. One, you might have practices closing. Former PAT patients find themselves 50 to 100 miles from a dentist, especially if they're in a rural area. You might have astronomical wait times, which will emerge in some areas. Underserved areas. I don't know if you've ever heard that term before, underserved. Basically, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it has to do with how many dentists per patients there are, or how many patient-dentist ratio in an area. When it hits a certain level, the government considers it underserved. But underserved areas will become more underserved. And yes, there'll be less dentists or offices. You may be busier for a period, but this void is not going to go unnoticed by DSOs, PPOs, or government officials. So what could this lead to? And I'm just speculating here. We could end up with any combination of public-private options, especially in underserved areas. You might have an office which is heavy network participation, a lot of government plans, insurance partnerships, government programs where they're paying to put offices. I mean, I've seen this happen to our clients. We had a client in Nebraska that was offered money by the state to open a practice somewhere. They were going to pay for the whole office. But you're going to end up with higher volume, low margin per patient, which this only works at scale with controlled labor costs. It's not the type of private dentistry that we're used to, that most people want to practice. So what I see happening and again, this is just pure speculation, is you're going to end up in dentistry with what we might consider 3 tiers of practicing dentists. And it could be 5 tiers, but let's just take 3 basic tiers here, okay? Tier 1 is going to be the independent. They control their fees, they're out of network, and they can drive demand into their practice, all right? That's what we're teaching our clients to be. Tier 2 is DSOs, potentially with insurance partnership and public partnership, meaning the government stepping in, heavy network participation, lower cost labor, etc. Tier 3 is what we're calling the squeezed middle. These are network dependent, volume driven practices. So this is the average doctor. This is the doctor collecting, 60, 70,000 a month, and they're 70% in network, and they're kind of making a living now, even though they've seen their expenses starting to go up over the last 4 or 5 years and their profit go down, and they're sort of just waiting it out, hoping things get better. That person is in trouble, in my opinion, over the next 5 to 10 years. Who wins is tier 1, the independent practice. They control their own fees. It's high quality private dentistry. Many of their patients might be insured, but the practice isn't in network. Tier 2, this is the DSO, public-private model, insurance company-driven model. This is heavy network, etc. Because here's what I think, is if you end up with a bunch of offices closing, and this is just, again, speculation. If you have a ton of offices close and there's no one to pick up the slack, what do you think is going to happen when government officials start to find out about this stuff? Where they're going to demand we have to put a dental office there, and we need to do this, and they're going to come up with different ideas on how to do that. And I'm going to be talking about this on an upcoming episode, but I don't know if you ever heard of something called a dental therapist. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. I've asked a bunch of clients about it. They have not. Now, I don't have all the numbers in front of me with regards to a dental therapist, but look it up. They usually are only allowed to practice in underserved areas. Like Minnesota was the first state, if I'm not mistaken, that kind of kicked off this concept. And basically, it's sort of like a master's type program. You take a hygienist, and I think it's a 2-year program. I could be completely wrong here. But what are these folks allowed to do? I think there's like 2 different levels of dental therapists, like advanced and basic, right? But they're allowed to place fillings, extract deciduous teeth, etc., right? When you get the advanced level dental therapist, they can do a lot of basic dentistry. They can extract simple extractions on adults. They can fill adult teeth, etc. And the idea was, if you didn't have enough dentists in an area, you could use dental therapists. It's sort of like we're all familiar with the concept of a physician's assistant or a nurse practitioner. That's what we got. So those are coming. As a matter of fact, they almost passed in the Florida legislature this year. Okay? So I would take a look at where that stands in your state, because if you have shortages in areas and no one wants to go to those areas, that might be what's coming in those areas. And I think personally, a dental therapist, if you use them properly, and usually, again, in most the areas that they are practicing dental therapists right now, they're usually only allowed to practice in underserved areas, but that could change over time. You see, and again, I'll do a show about this so you can kind of get a little bit more info on it. I did a bit of research on it. Obviously, I don't have it in front of me because I'm not reading it to you. But they could be a force multiplier for a private dentist. If I had a dental therapist, I could, go into an op, prep 6 crowns. They could do the fillings. They could even make the temps, and, I could split. It would actually help. It would be like a super assistant, right? And they could do some basic stuff for me. But eventually, when you end up with these advanced therapists, you could have literally one doctor. They don't have to have direct supervision. They don't even have to be on site. They could be managing 5 or 6 dental therapists in 5 or 6 different offices. So if we end up with no doctors in areas, there's just no dentist, that's what's going to fill the gap to some degree or another. So I would suggest that, to sort of continue or carry the torch for private dentistry, if you're looking at adding offices or going into an office, I would suggest looking in those areas. Look in these rural areas, because there's definite opportunity there. So we've got tier 1, the independent doctor. Tier 2, this is going to be everything, the DSOs, the insurance companies, public-private options, etc., or partnerships. The middle, tier 3, is where the danger is. The top and the bottom both have a path. Tier 1, tier 2, the middle gets eaten. Why? Well, we've gone over this earlier. For the average heavily in network volume-driven practice, the math is not working anymore. We had 22% inflation from 2020 to 2024, 28% through 2026. Real income has declined by 13%. PPO rates are flat or down, reimbursements, which is effectively a 35% pay cut. So, again, if you're really looking at this, do you think this is going to improve or it's going to get worse? is all of us, inflation's not going to go anywhere. It might slow down, but it's not going to go anywhere. I don't think insurance company CEOs are going to wake up one morning and go, we've been treating these dentists really bad. We should increase reimbursement. I really don't see that. Maybe I'm an idiot, but I don't really see that happening. So if I'm you, I would want to move myself into becoming the independent doctor who's not network dependent. Sure, I have patients who are in network. I'm just not participating, and they're paying a higher copay, but I'm delivering the type of care that I want to deliver, right? That would be the direction I would be moving towards if I wanted to make sure that I was successful over the next 10 years long term. So here's what I'd suggest. I mentioned to you earlier in the episode, this is sort of the path forward, becoming that independent. And there's a number of points that you would want to start working on in order to move towards making sure your practice is fully independent. We have something called the Independent Practice Roadmap. It's a consultation. We do it for free. I'll put a link to it on the episode webpage. If you want to check it out and find out what you can do to start moving your practice in that direction, because it might take some time, especially if you're heavily in network. And it's not just about getting out of plans. There's a lot more to this, okay? But this is something that I would do if I were you, if your long-term goal was to have a successful, profitable, practice where you're not working out of 3 or 4 operatories trying to make ends meet, but you're doing the type of dentistry that you want to do. That would be my suggestion to you. Anyway, so that's sort of the overall picture from what we see here as to what's happening in the industry. There's opportunity there. There's also, if you don't take action, in my opinion, potential problems, as I've mentioned throughout the episode. And obviously, look, if you're listening to this, you're interested in doing something to improve your practice. You're interested in practice improvement if you're listening to this. So my suggestion to you would be do that consultation. Find out what you can do to start moving yourself in the right direction and setting yourself up so that you're successful in practicing the way that you want over the next 10, 20 years. Because, look, there's a lot of people depending on you. It's between you and your family, it's your team and your patients and your future patients. So I'd say you owe it to yourself to take care of yourself to make sure that you're doing well going into the future. Anyway, folks, that's all I have for you this week. I know it's a longer episode, but I do it every year. I have the slideshow download on the episode webpage. You can go through all this. I have all the numbers as well as all the sources at the bottom of the various slides. And don't forget the link to the Independent Practice Roadmap consultation there. You can fill that out. It's free. There's no obligation. I would definitely recommend that you check it out. Otherwise, if you want to find out more about MGE, you can find us online at mgeonline.com or call us at 800-640-1140. Folks, have a great week, and we'll see you at the next episode.